Hey everybody, welcome to Mammoth Interactive's YouTube channel. First of all, I want to thank you for watching this video. And remember that this channel doesn't do Patreon. Instead, we sell our digital courses down below. And every single dollar that we get from the products you buy below goes into making more content. The best way to help out this channel and Mammoth Interactive is to subscribe to Mammoth Interactive's huge library of content. Get thousands of hours and hundreds of courses for a low price down below. We have a monthly option and a yearly option. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the video.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to our course. In this lecture, we are doing a preview of the upcoming project that we will build together from scratch in Android Studio with Kotlin. The project is going to be a random number app. We will have a text view and a button that will generate a random number each time the user presses the button. Throughout the way, we're going to learn a lot about how to lay out a project and add items. We'll also learn how to extract strings to make reusable string resources. We'll learn about positioning and also how to make toasts, which are messages that appear for a short time. Join me in the next lecture. We are going to get started. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Android course. In this lecture, we are starting a brand new project of building our random number generator app. Navigate to Android Studio and hit Create New Project. We are starting completely from scratch here with our new app. Next, we are going to have to select a project template. We are going to start with an empty activity. As you can see here, you can select from different activities like a basic activity, a bottom navigation activity, a master/detail flow, a login activity, which means that you'll be starting with pre-built code and design already for you available. These are quite useful activities, but we're starting with an empty activity so we can learn from scratch. Hit Next to now configure the project. First, give your project a name such as random number. That can be the name. Then we have a package name, which is com.example.randomNumber. This package name you want to be unique because it is the package name that will be on the Google Play Store, and so this has to be unique in order to get published. This is your unique identifier for your app. So I'm going to change this from com.example to something more unique, like com.mammoth.interactive.randomNumber. Then select a save location for your app by clicking the folder icon and then selecting the folder where you want to save this app. Now, with the save location, you want to make sure you don't have any white space in whatever folder you're saving your new project to. So I'm going to remove that subfolder and instead save my file here to a new folder called Android/random number app. Even though I don't have Android or random number app in my computer, Android Studio will create two new folders. It will create the Android folder and then a subfolder random number app. And into that random number app folder, it's going to put all of the files of my random number app. The language we're working with is Kotlin, and the minimum SDK is API 19. Take note about this minimum SDK because if I select API 19, my app will run on approximately 98% of devices. But if I select a higher API like API 30, my app will run on less than 1% of devices. So take note which minimum SDK you choose. I'm going to choose API 19. The SDK you choose here for your app, it also has to match the SDK of your emulator, your virtual device, or your actual device that you're testing the app on. You can also choose to use legacy Android support libraries, which will allow you to use older libraries, but we don't need them for now. Alright, then hit Finished, and this is going to create all of the files for your app. Give the app a few minutes to build, and then you will see that your main activity.kt will open. This is a Kotlin file that contains the main activity of the app. At the top of the main activity file, we see the package name. Then we see some import lines of necessary libraries. And then we have the class main activity. This contains the onCreate function. This function will run when the main activity class is created, so when the app is created. Alright, we also have this activity_main.xml file, and we can see here this contains the design view of our app, both the light mode and the dark mode, and by default there is just the text hello world, but we could add in more content like buttons, image views, scroll views, and much more. If we want to see the project hierarchy, we go to the left hand side where we see one project, and then we can look at different app folders of this project. And even though we're in Kotlin, we still have the folder called Java here, and that's just so that our app is compatible with Java as well as Kotlin. We have other files like res, which contains layout, code, values, which are different strings and constants, and then we have test folders and the main activity file. We can hit the minus sign here to hide that sidebar. That way we have more view of our design mode. If we want to switch to the code view, go to the top right hand corner, and instead of design, hit the button that says code. This is the code behind that design that we just saw. At the top we have the XML version. Then we have the constraint layout. This is the layout type of our app. Constraint layout means that you can apply constraints to set the position of items on the page. Then we have a text view that says hello world, and then we have the end of the constraint layout tag. This is an XML type. You'll notice here the file type is .xml. If you've ever worked with HTML, then you'll be somewhat familiar with XML because we have this opening tag constraint layout, then we have this closing tag constraint layout. We are going to learn a lot about XML and building out the app via code in this course. Let's start by looking at this text view object. You'll notice here it has a layout width of wrap content and a layout height of wrap content. That means the width and height of the text view will be whatever width and height is needed in order to enclose its content. You see here if I hover over wrap content, I even get this little hint. The view should only be big enough to enclose its content plus padding. Now what is the content? Well, the content is this Android text property hello world. I could change this to random number instead, and that is going to change the view of my app. If I hit the button in the top right hand corner that says split, I can now see a split view of the code and also the app visual. I can zoom out and zoom in, and look here, now my label says random number. It doesn't say hello world. Okay, let's go back to code view, and we can see here we also have 4 constraint properties, and that sets the position of our text view. We're going to be working with constraints a lot throughout this course. Let's go ahead and change our constraint layout to be a more simpler layout because we're just starting off with app development and we want to work with a simpler layout than constraints because constraints can get a bit messy. So let's remove this constraint layout completely, the opening tag, and also you have to remove the closing tag as well, take note. And let's instead put in a linear layout. Start typing linear layout and then hit enter, and that will auto-complete linear layout. And you'll notice here, if you close the opening tag, then you'll also get a closing tag created for you. And let's place that closing tag after our text view. So what does this mean? It means that our text view, which is our only app object, it is going to be inside of a linear layout. Okay, currently our linear layout is outlined in red, and that is a hint to us if something is outlined in red or colored in red. That's a hint that something is wrong that you have to fix. So what we have to do is add several properties to our linear layout to remove the red error. We're going to first add in an XML/NS Android property, and we'll set this equal to http schemas.android.com/apk/res/android. That is a location for the XML that we want. We also need to specify XML/NS tools, and this is 1 and 2 of the properties required for linear layout. So the tools are located at, not that location, but http schemas.android.com/tools. Okay, as well, we're going to need to set the Android layout width, and we can set this to match parent. So the layout width of the whole app will be as big as its parent, which is just the app itself. We are going to use this tools namespace later on, so don't worry if it's in gray right now. That just means you're not using it yet, but we will put it to use later. We also want to set Android layout height, as you can imagine, and this is going to be wrap content. So the height, instead of being the whole height of the app, which would be match parent, instead the height is going to be only big enough to enclose its content. Then we want to set the tools context. Not content description, but context is what we need. And the context is .mainActivity. How do I know this? Well, because mainActivity.kt, this is the file that launches my app, and that's why it is the context for my tools. And now in our text view, we are going to remove the constraint properties. And why? Well, because if we hover over this, we can now no longer access attributes of constraint, and that's because we changed our layout from a constraint layout to a linear layout, just to simplify things for when we're starting off. That means we have to remove these 4 properties called constraint because they're no longer accessible to us. Instead, we just are left with these 3 properties for text view: the width, the height, and the text random number. If we look at our split view now and we zoom in, well, we could just look at design view as well, and we zoom in, we can see our layout has somewhat changed. Our random number text, it's now at the very top and the left-hand corner of our app instead of being where we had earlier in the center. And we're actually going to change this later. We're going to manually, with code, move the text back to the center. But why did it move to the top here? Well, if we go back to code view, we can see we removed all the constraints we had. If I hit undo, I can see I had these constraints, constraining to the bottom, constraining to the left, constraining to the right, and constraining to the top. Because I had constraints on all 4 sides, that's what moved my item into the center of the app. But by removing them, I no longer have any constraint on the app, and so therefore, or any constraint on the text view to be specific, the text view object no longer had any constraints. That's why it moved to this top left. And not to worry, we are going to be looking at how we can move that item around again and learning a lot about layouts as we do it. Okay, so we just created our project and we set up our layout for the app. What we can work on next is adding in more to our user interface. So our next step is going to be to add a button. Join me in the next lecture where we learn how to add a button with code. Hello everyone and welcome back to our Android course. In this lecture we're going to add yet another object to our app here, our random number generator, and that object is going to be a button. When the user hits the button, we are going to generate a random number. We could generate the object via the palette here on the left-hand side, or we can generate it programmatically via code, via this activity_main.xml file in the code view. Let's use the code view to generate a button. Alright, so below our text view, we're going to hit enter a few times and we're going to generate a button object. Start typing button and then hit enter, because this is going to automatically create for you, it's going to auto-generate two properties of the button, the layout width and the layout height. Now don't forget to also close the button tag so you don't forget. Just like HTML, XML requires us to close tags, and a button is self-closing, meaning that you can close it in the same tag where you open it. Alright, so let's set the properties. You'll notice here we have this red squiggly line underneath the quotations of the string, and that's because we have to give the value of layout width and layout height something. So let's use the wrap content value for layout width and also wrap content for layout height. What does wrap content mean? Well, it means that the button will only be big enough to enclose its content plus padding, but it won't be any more. It won't be 500 pixels, it won't be half of the screen, it will just be enough to contain its content. Now, what is the button content? If I go to my design view, I can already see a button, but it has no content. So where did the button get this content from? Well, if you don't put any content into the button, if you don't give it a piece of text or an integer, then it will just create this default size. That's why we can see this purple button. The default color is also purple, and the default location is right beside our random number label. If we go back to code, we can give this button some custom content. How do we do that? Well, it's actually very similar to how we gave custom content to our text view. For our text view, we gave it custom content by using the Android text property. And that's exactly what we're going to use as well for our button. We're going to use the Android text property to set the text that we want inside of our button. I'm going to use the text of generate random number. So when the user hits the button, it will generate a random number. That's why this is a logical piece of text for the button. Now if I go back to design view, look at this. I have the text generate random number in my button. Great, I just created a button. What are we going to do next? Well, next up, we are going to extract this string, because it's best practice in Android Studio, developing for Android, it's best practice to extract your string resources. So instead of just hard coding this Android text to be generate random number, I'm going to extract this into a string. Join me in the next lecture where we are going to learn how to extract strings. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Android course. In the previous lecture, we built a button for our app, and it says generate random number. Later on, we are going to actually enable this button to work. But our next step is going to be to extract this string, generate a random number, which is the string of the button. We're going to extract it instead to become a string resource. How do we find all of our string resources? Well, if we go to our project hierarchy and we go to our res folder, our resources folder, we have this file called strings.xml. If we open the file, we can see the file has a resources tag, which means any content inside of the resources tag will be considered a resource. We already have one resource, which is the string name of app name, random number. That's the name of our app, and that's the default resource string already created for us. We can make another string to be another string resource. So what we'll do is we'll click on this string that says generate random number, and if you hover over it, you can see we have this note that says hard-coded string generate number should use @string resource. This means Android Studio is prompting us to use a string resource instead of hard-coding a string. This is best practice, and it allows you to reuse your strings much more easily, because if I update one of my strings in my resources file, that string will be updated everywhere in the whole app. Okay, so how do I turn my text generate random number into a string resource? Well, I can either hover over the string and select extract string resource, or I can manually go to my string resources file, strings.xml, and here I can make a new string as well manually. So for that, I'm going to create a new string. I will give it the name of my random number label. The text is going to be generate random number, and then the closing string was automatically created for me. Now that I have this string, I can put it to use inside of activity main. There is a specific syntax for referencing a string resource. Instead of using this hard-coded string, what I'm going to do is still put it into string quotations, but I'm going to use the @string, and I'm going to select my random number label. You can see here it's already prompted for me as my first option actually in this drop-down menu. If I hit enter, it will create for me this string resource random number label. We need this @string preceding the random number label to specify that random number label is not a variable or some text, but it's actually a string resource. Now if we go into our design view, we can see here we still have generate random number. It's still working. And I can also run my app, and I will see that when I run my app in my virtual device, my emulator, it will look exactly the same as one of these design previews. All right, what do we need to do next? Well, next up, we are going to add more positioning to our app objects, because currently the two objects are both in the top left-hand corner, but I am going to move those objects to be in the center of the screen and center aligned. Join me in the next lecture to position objects. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Android course. In the previous lecture, we set up string resources in our strings.xml file. In this lecture, we are going to continue building our simple app by learning how to adjust the position of items on the app. All right, for this, let's navigate to a code view of our app where we have a linear layout object followed by a text view object and a button object. We are going to start with linear layout, and we are going to add another property for our linear layout tag, and that is going to be Android orientation. We can set either horizontal or vertical to set the orientation of our app. All right, so now that we have our orientation, this is going to stack our items. If I go to design, look at this. Now our items are stacked. By default, the Android orientation is horizontal. And when the orientation was horizontal, it means that all of the views, they get put side by side. But because we changed our orientation to vertical, now by default, our items are one on top of the other. All right, now that we have set the orientation of our layout, let's go to our text view next, and we are going to give our text view a layout gravity attribute. We will put that below the height. We are going to set Android layout gravity, and we are going to use center horizontal as our layout gravity for the text view. Now if we go to design view, look at this, our random number label, that is now centered horizontally on the app instead of being by default on the left hand side. We can do the same for our button. we can give our button a layout gravity property of center horizontal. So now both our text view and our button have the layout gravity center horizontal. And if I go to my design view, look at this. Now I can see that my label and my button, they are both centered horizontally. They're not centered vertically yet, they're only centered horizontally. Let's go back to the code, and now we're going to center the items vertically as well. So how can we do that? Well, we are going to go to our linear layout, and we're going to add another property alongside orientation. We are going to give the Android layout gravity property this time to linear layout, and we are going to use center vertical as our layout gravity for the linear layout. Now if we go to design view and we zoom out a little bit, look at this. We can see all of our items, of which we only have 2. They are both in the center vertically now as well. And how did that happen? Well, that's thanks to us setting the layout gravity of their parent object, which is the linear layout. Remember, the linear layout, it's the parent that contains the text view and the button. That's why when I set the layout gravity of my linear layout, it's going to vertically center any objects inside of the linear layout. All right, what we can do next is make it a bit easier to see all of our content by increasing its text size. So inside of my linear layout, let's say I wanted to change the text size. And I try to use text size and set it to some value like 50 SP. Then if I go to my design view, I'll notice that nothing really changed. That's because for text size, you want to set it on individual views, not on the layout. So I am going to apply the text size to my text view, and now if I go to my design view, look at this, random number just got a whole lot bigger in terms of size. And I can do the same for generate random number, that button. I can give it a text size property of 50 SP as well, and whoa, that's a pretty huge button now. Okay, so now we can change that to be a bit smaller because 50 is quite a bit big for our app size. Okay, look at this. Now we can see here we have random number being a lot bigger, and then our button generate random number also being quite big. We can also notice here if I set my text size to 20 SP, then the button doesn't touch the corners of the app screen. And if I click and drag on the little buttons on the sides of the button, I can actually increase the height of my button. And if I go back to my code, it actually will automatically change the layout height for me to 195 dp instead of being wrap content, which we had previously. If I set my layout height to wrap content instead and go back to design, then my button height resets. All right, so that is how we can position items and also, as a bonus, change the size of text. We can also run this app and we'll see that it will look the same in our emulator, or even if we plug in an actual Android device like a phone or a tablet, the app will look the same as it does right here in our preview. We can test out that emulator. I'll just pull it up in my other tab. Here is my emulator, and I could bring my emulator to the correct size, and then we can see here is our app in the emulator. Now the emulator is a separate app that opens, and here we can see the emulator looks almost exactly the same as the design preview. The only difference really is that in this emulator, we also have the app title random number coming from that string resource of app title. And we can also interact with the app. I could click on this button and you can see it goes a different color of purple. Right now nothing happens when I click the button, but I will add in functionality to make something happen shortly. With the emulator, I can also play with the virtual device as if it were a real device. Alright, join me in the next lecture. What can we work on next? Well, I think next up we should actually start adding in functionality to make the button work. Alright, so join me in the next lecture to work on the button. Hello everyone and welcome back to our Android course. In the previous lecture, we changed the position of our app items and we also changed the font size. What we are going to work on next is making the button perform an action. Alright, the first step to making the button perform an action is to enter the code view of our activity main file, and we have to give the button an ID. That way we can reference the button by its ID. If you're familiar with HTML and CSS, then you'll know that objects on a web page, they also need to have an ID or at least a class tag property, and it's the same in XML. If we want to reference a button, we want to give it an ID. This is a unique identifier. Alright, so let's go to activity main and go to our button. And in our button, we are going to add in an Android ID property. Now, what should the ID attribute be? Well, it's really up to us. We can call our ID anything we want. I highly recommend making the ID something that is related to the actual button task. First, we have to preface the name of the ID with this @+ID/. This means that whatever text comes after this prefix is an ID. It's not just a string, but it's an actual ID, an identifier. I'm going to give my button the ID of random number button. Okay, so I will now be able to reference this button with its ID. Okay, now let's go to our main activity Kotlin file. Remember, this is the file that opens our app. It has this function onCreate, which will run as soon as the app is created. We are going to add in to this main activity class a reference to our button. First, we'll make a new value that we'll call random number button. It will be of type button, and we are going to use the function known as findViewById. This is a pre-built function. We didn't make it. It's pre-built, available for us to use to find a view, like a button or a text view, by its ID. You'll notice here, currently the button is colored red, and if you hover over the text, you'll see this message, unresolved reference button. That's because if we want to use a button inside of this main activity file, we have to import it. So far, all we have imported is the app compat activity and the Android OS bundle. But we don't automatically have access to XML items like button. Instead, we have to hover over button and hit that import button. This is going to import android.widget.button. In the widget library, there is a button view object. That's where that XML button tag comes from. And that is how we can use button. Now, how do we use findViewById? Well, we have to pass in the required argument for the ID. We can't just call the random number button, which is our ID. We actually have to prefix that ID with r.id. This is the prefix that states that random number button is an ID. Okay, so now findViewById will be able to work. Okay, so let's see. We can just hit save. We can also hit clean project under the menu build. We can clean the project, and this file shouldn't have any trouble grabbing this find view by ID function. Just make sure you don't have this capital D. There, that was the issue. Okay, so take a note that Kotlin is case sensitive, similar to a lot of languages like JavaScript. Almost every language really is case sensitive, so make sure find view by ID has this lowercase d at the end. Okay, so now we have no errors, and that means we're successfully grabbing the button and storing it in this value random number button. What is going to be our next step? Well, the next step is to actually perform some action. So I can add another function below on create. Let's call this function something like generate random number. And just like that, I've opened up the function header and an empty function body. I can also make this function private, meaning it's only accessible to this class. Inside of this function, I could create some action that I want to perform, such as I could make a toast. If I first tell you I'm going to make a toast, that probably sounds really weird to you if you've never worked with Android Studio, but a toast is the Android Studio term for a notification that appears in your app, a view that appears for a short amount of time and then disappears. So how can I make a new toast object? Well, I can use the make text function of the toast class. Make text requires several arguments. First, we have to put in a context object. This will allow us to get information about the current state of our app. So what context are we going to use to display the toast? We are going to use this. This refers to app compat activity. App compat activity is our context because app compat activity, it is a subclass of context. There is a context class, and app compat activity is a subclass of context. The next argument we want to pass in is the message that we want to show as soon as the user hits the button. This can be any message you want, such as I'm a toast. And then we also need an argument for the duration of the toast. What is the duration? Well, there are some pre-made constants for us, like length long and length short. These are constants from the toast class. If we use length long, the toast will appear on the screen for a long amount of time. But if we use length short, the toast will appear for a short amount of time. I will use toast length long, and that will be the duration of my toast on the app. Finally, I have to call one more function, and that is show. This is appended to the make text function. What does show mean? Well, show means that we'll actually display the toast. Don't forget that extra appended function. Otherwise, the toast won't show, because make text, it makes the toast, but it doesn't actually show it. All right, so now we've made this generate random number function. But is that enough? If you've ever programmed before, then you'll know that this is not enough, because yes, we've made the function, right? But we haven't actually called it. You see, on create, that is a life cycle function, which means it will always automatically be run as soon as the function is, or the app is created. But generate random number, it's not a life cycle function. It won't automatically be called at some point. Instead, we have to make sure that we call this function somewhere. Otherwise, it's known as an unused function. Just like how this value is unused and it's colored in gray, the generate random number function. It's colored in gray because it's unused. So let's actually put it to use. How can we put it to use? Well, what we are going to do is grab our random number button, and look, immediately it's not gray anymore, it's now black, and that's because it's now being used. And we are going to use a setOnClickListener function. This is a listener. It listens for the click of the random number button. You can use this function on any button and it will listen for a click. This is very similar to JavaScript, making listeners for HTML buttons to be clicked. Then inside of parentheses or curly brackets, we can specify what we want to happen when the random number button is clicked. So what do we want to happen? Well, we want our toast to appear. So what we will do is we are going to call our generate random number function. Now we're actually putting it to use. And look, it's not gray anymore. It's now blue. All right. And just like that, we will be able to listen for the button's click, and when it's clicked, we will make the toast. Let's hit the big green run button in our header in order to test out our app. Okay, here my app has loaded. Now watch carefully. If I click on my generate random number button, it will give me that purple feedback that I clicked it, and did you see that toast? That little toast appear that says I'm a toast. And you'll notice it stays for a long period of time. That's relative to a short period of time. All right, and just like that, we have enabled our button to do something. In this lecture, we learned how to reference our button and then how to make it perform some action with a listener. We also learned what is a toast, which is unique to Android Studio. We learned that a toast is a message that appears in the app for a limited amount of time. All right, what should we work on next? Well, next I think we should actually finish our app main functionality, which is to generate a random number. Because sure, right now we are generating a toast, but we're not actually generating a random number. Let's go ahead and actually generate a random number in the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Android course. In the previous lecture, we enabled our button to generate a toast. And in this lecture, we are going to expand on that and allow our button to generate a random number. Our first step is to go to the code view of our activity main file, and in our text view, similarly to how we gave our button an ID, we are going to give our text view an ID as well. That way we can reference the text view and update the text view content. Alright, so I'm going to give the text view an Android ID property. I'm going to use the prefix ampersand plus ID slash, and then I'm going to set any ID I want, such as, for example, random number text. Okay, now I can reference my text view using this ID. So inside of main activity.kt, let's make a reference to our new text ID. I will make a value that I will call my random number text, and this is going to be of type text view. And I can grab the text view that I want using its ID. First, I do have to import a reference to the text view widget. Okay, and what I'm going to do is use the find view by ID function again, and I'm going to grab it using r.id dot random number text, which is the ID that I just created in my XML file. Okay, so now I could change the text of my random number text value. I could grab its text property and set it to something like hit the button. Now if I run my app, even though the design of the app still says random number in the text view, I am now going to override that with my function onCreate, which means when the app is created, the text view will now say hit the button instead. And I can test that out by hitting run to run my app. And once I see a success green box, that means I can open my emulator and I will see the difference. My random number text view will say hit the button. And that is different to what I have in my design view, which is random number. Because design view, it uses the code of the XML file, which still says random number. But my main activity Kotlin file, this can override the text in the text view. All right, I got the success notification. So here is my app again, and this time if I hit generate random number, it still works for the toast. But look, my text view now says hit the button. This verifies that we were able to change the text view to say hit the button instead of random number. All right, so now that we know how to change the text view, all we have to do is change the text view to display a random number. This isn't specific to Android Studio or Kotlin. This is just writing an algorithm that will display a random number. We can do this in mainActivity.kt. I will just go to run and stop app to stop my emulator. And I am going to display a random number. So inside of generate random number, I could keep the toast, sure, and I could also add in a value called random number, and I'll generate a random number from 1 to 10 using the random function. This is the syntax for generating a random number from 1 to 10 with Kotlin. Then what I can do is grab random number text, and I can change its text value to equal random number. I do have to put it to a string because random number returns an integer, but random number text expects a string. Now we're going to get this error that says that we cannot grab random number text, and that's because random number text is a variable that we defined in a different function onCreate, which means we can't actually access it in another function. Instead, we have to take our value and we have to call it in generate random number instead. That way we can access it inside of generate random number. Otherwise, it's not accessible to us because it's in a different function. We could also now remove random number text.text to equal hit the button, because instead of saying hit the button, we are going to set the text view to show a random number from 1 to 10 instead. All right, let's go ahead and test out our result. I will hit run to relaunch the app. All right, here's our emulator. If I hit generate random number now, look at this. The number 10 has appeared in my text view. If I hit the button again, now I get the number 3. And again, I get 8, 4, 3, 3, 9, 7, 4. Look at that. Every time I hit my button, I'm still generating a toast and I am generating a random number. We really don't need that toast anymore, so we could just remove this toast.makeTextLine. That way we won't be generating a toast. All right, and look at that. We have made our random number app. What we will work on next is jump into a new section. Join me in the next section we are going to learn even more Android Studio and Kotlin development. Hello everyone and welcome back to our Android course. In this lecture, we are doing a preview of the app that we will be building in this section. This is the app. It's an information app, meaning it provides information about something. In this case, it's going to provide information about Kotlin. And this app is going to contain 3 key items: a title, an image, and a scroll view. Throughout building this project, we are going to learn a lot about layout, as well as making string resources, dimension resources, making reusable styles, and also bringing in images to our app. Let's go ahead and get started with this practical project in the next lecture. Hello everyone and welcome back to our Android course. In this lecture, we are setting up a brand new project. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to hit Create New Project, and let's select a project template of an empty activity. Then hit Next, and let's call this project, instead of my application, we will call this project our information app. So I'll call this information. Choose a unique package name and a save location that includes this new folder. The language is Kotlin. The minimum SDK is API 19. And we don't need any legacy libraries. After this, hit Finish. Alright, and here is our app. The project hierarchy has now loaded, which means we can navigate around the app. Let's go ahead and open activity main, the XML file. This contains the design and the code behind the design of our app. Throughout this whole project, we're going to learn how we can position and style objects in the app via the design view and also via the code view. Let's begin here in the code view. In the code view, we have a constraint layout as our parent object, and we have a child object that is a text view that contains the text "Hello World." And as soon as our build loads, we'll be able to see our app right here. There we go. We can hide all the side bars, and this is our app now. By default, it has this text "Hello World," as you can see here. This is the design view, and then in the code view, we can directly edit the code view to affect the design view. Let's start by changing the constraint layout type instead to a linear layout type, because it's going to be easier for us to work with a linear layout instead of a constraint type. What we are going to keep is the XML NS property for the Android and the app and the tools. We can keep all 3 of these properties the same because they're loading in Android. Then for the layout width and the layout height, we can keep those match parent. This means they will be exactly the same as the parent object, which is the app itself. The tools context is going to be .main activity. This is our Kotlin file that opens the app. Alright, so now we have a linear layout with a text view. If we go to our design view, we can see we've changed the app a bit. The change is that now the Hello World text is at the top of the app instead of at the center. Because instead of using a constraint layout, we are now using a linear layout, and that's the difference that a linear layout creates. A linear layout by default will put the default item at the top left-hand corner. Okay, what are we going to work on next? Well, we're going to add in our first item. Currently, we have a text view, the default text view Hello World. We could also add in our own text view. For that, we would go to the palette and we could drag in another text view. You see right here, I could put it right beside my Hello World. I could add in another text view. And there now we have 2 text views in our app right beside each other. If we want to see the two items in the component tree, we click on the lower left-hand corner on component tree, and now we can hide the palette and we can see our component tree, which has a linear layout, the parent object. It has two child objects. It has Hello World and it has text view. We could delete Hello World by doing a right click and delete on it. So I'm going to hit delete, and look at that. Now Hello World is gone from the component tree and only text view remains. And you'll notice by default, text view takes up all of the width of the app. If we go back to the code view, we can see our Hello World text view has disappeared, and instead we have this new text view. By default, every text view has an ID. It also has a layout width and a layout height of wrap content, which means that the width and height will be just enough to contain the content. Every default text view also has a layout weight and the text inside of the text view. I can go back to design view and hide the component tree now. And if I click on the top right-hand corner on this attributes button, I can now see all those same attributes that we just saw in code. They're also available for us in our attributes view. Here we have declared attributes, layout, transforms, common attributes, and all attributes. You can also quickly search for attributes with the search bar. And you can see many of the attributes correspond to what we just saw in code. We have layout width, layout height, we have text. If I change this text via code or via the design view, it will change in my preview. I could change this to Kotlin information instead, and look at that, my preview has updated to say Kotlin information, or more simply just Kotlin. We can look at other properties as well, like common attributes. Here we can set different attributes of the text. Alright, in the next lecture we're going to dive deeper into styling and positioning this text view. Before we do move on, I'm going to encourage you to play around with the attributes yourself before joining me in the next lecture to get started with styling our text view.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this course. If you want to watch the rest of the course, the link is down below. Not only will you get the access to this course, but you'll get access to a lot of other courses in a huge bundle, and it's on sale today. So buy before the sale ends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.